Hello, check.
Yeah. Just say not on. Yeah,
How many you can make for host?
Good evening from Indian Christian College here. We have with us Professor Haley and a host of participants from different fields and colleges and from a team of organizing committee here. I would like to welcome all of you to this last and final session of a first day of this international seminar on Art on the Age, tackling global environmental crisis. So, good evening, Professor Haley from UCC India here.
Good evening, thank you.
Yes. May I take this privilege to welcome everyone here. We have with us Principal Dr. R.M. Mani, Union Christian College. We have also with us the Vice Principal, the Dean, and the other esteemed colleagues and other members joining from other colleges here. And I would like to take this time briefly to introduce to all of us here Dr. Kharshiing, an Associate Professor of Botany, St. Edmund's College. He has completed his 2 postdoctoral research from Italian National Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development, Rome, Italy, 2007 and 8, and from the University of Glasgow, UK, 2012 and 13. He's also a recipient of a number of awards. This include the DBT Research Associate Award at University of Glasgow, UK, 2012 and 13. There are also Annual Research Fellowship Award in ENA, Rome, Italy, and DST-DAAD Scholarship Award at University from Germany, 2005 and 6. So we have with us our esteemed chairperson who will be chairing this session. So I now would like to hand over this time to Dr. Kharshiing to take over and chair the session. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Jim. I'm very happy to be hosting this session of the international seminar, and very happy also to be hosting Dr. Haley, as Dr. Jim had said. So Dr. Haley is an associate professor and the director of postgraduate studies in the international relations at the Universidad Torquato di Tella in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She's also been a faculty in politics and international relations at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and her research basically is on international environmental policy and also on sustainable development and a green economy. And this evening, Dr. Haley will be presenting to us her talk on organized hypocrisy in global climate governance. So Dr. Haley, the stage is yours.
Well, firstly, I would like to thank you very much for this invitation. 10 years ago, I had the real privilege. I need some someone to deactivate their microphone. I can hear an echo. Sorry, Dr. Jim, if you could please mute your microphone because it's creating an echo. Yes, perfect, thanks. So as I was saying, 10 years ago, I had the privilege and pleasure of attending this conference or a version of this conference at your beautiful campus in India. And so when I received the invitation last year to return and to give a presentation, I accepted without hesitation. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you today to share some of my thoughts 10 years later on what's happening in global climate governance. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll now bring up. So I trust that you can see the presentation, the PowerPoint.
Yes, yes ma'am, we can see it.
Okay, just okay, great. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the problem of hypocrisy in global climate governance. And by this, I mean the inconsistencies or the decoupling of rhetoric, decisions, and actions related to climate policy. I'll explain that a particular form of hypocrisy, organized hypocrisy, is pervasive in the UN system for governing climate change. And I'll explain why I think this matters, why it's a problem. I'll outline some ideas that might be done to make climate policy more consistent and more coherent. So basically, there'll be three parts to the talk this evening. What is organized hypocrisy? Why does it matter? And what can we do about it? So firstly, though, I'll give a little bit of context to my thinking around this and my concerns around this issue. So it was in 2005, now 20 years ago, that I began studying global climate politics. And at this time, 20 years ago, climate change was an issue of concern, but it was still fairly marginal. It wasn't a mainstream. It wasn't a mainstream or widespread concern at this time. It was still fairly marginal. At this time, activists were still trying to get governments to take the issue seriously. Politicians and industry leaders could still get away with saying that the scientific evidence is still uncertain, it's still inconclusive about the causes of climate change and about the severity of the problem. So that the priority then was to get them to take it seriously. Now, over the years, the issue of climate change moved from the margins to the mainstream. I saw this in my own professional field of political science, international relations, that previously climate change was talked about in a very kind of one panel on the last day of a conference might be dedicated to environmental politics. Over the years, this changed, and climate change became a much more kind of central issue on political science agenda. Mainstream scholars began taking an interest. Media coverage grew on climate change, and it became less and less acceptable for politicians or for anybody in the public space to question the science about climate change. That still occurred. We still did see pockets of denial, but it became less and less acceptable to question the science. So it seemed that the activists had an important victory, that finally climate change was on the agenda. By the time that the Paris Agreement was being negotiated and finalized in 2015, it was no longer enough to pay lip service to the issue. Politicians and industry actors couldn't get away with simply, saying a few words in recognition of climate change. By 2015, everybody from the CEO of big oil corporations to the heads of state in countries in the global north and the global south, suddenly everyone was declaring themselves committed to the fight against climate change. So previously, where we had silence about climate change or cautions about scientific uncertainty, by 2015, this had been replaced by bold declarations of ambition across the political spectrum in many countries. Now, rather than feeling comforted by this, I was feeling increasingly uneasy as everybody seemed to be committed to climate change. From the CEO of Shell, it was making me feel increasingly uneasy. And then 10 years ago, it was about 10 years ago that I came across this. It's a tiny little book by this very highly respected philosopher from Princeton University, Harry Frankfurt. And I'll just use the short name to avoid offending anybody, but on BS. And Frankfurt, in this small book, Harry Frankfurt, this philosopher, was arguing that one of the most salient features of our culture today is indifference to truth. Indifference to truth. And he explained that this is not necessarily the same thing as lying. I won't get into the semantics now, but basically if somebody is lying, they are deliberately trying to deceive somebody by saying something that they know is untrue. Indifference to truth is a bit different than simply lying. Indifference to truth entails being careless with the truth. It involves saying whatever one thinks will advance their interests, irrespective of whether what they're saying is accurate or not. When somebody is indifferent to truth, they don't make any attempt to confirm whether what they're saying is accurate. If your audience accepts what you're saying, then your objective has been achieved. It doesn't matter if what you're saying is rock solid truth, whether it's a half truth or whether it's a bit shaky on the evidence or whether it's downright wrong. When somebody is indifferent to truth, they really don't care whether something is downright wrong, a bit shaky on the evidence, or rock solid truth. They're not concerned about that. They're concerned about having the audience believe what they're saying, perhaps getting them off their back by saying what they think they need to say. And I found, reading this book, I found that it captured what had been worrying me about global climate governance. That denial, climate change denial, was no longer the most serious challenge to addressing the problem. Denial, to a large extent, I saw had been replaced by this indifference to truth. That everyone was suddenly committed to ambitious action on climate change, but the gap between their words, their rhetoric, and their actions seemed enormous, and seemed to be growing. This gap between what they were saying and what they were doing was growing ever greater. So we were surrounded by declarations, by pledges and policies promising this ambitious action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, emissions were growing, and all projections of emissions were continuing to show growth. So there was something missing between what was being said and what was being done. And I think that indifference to truth kind of struck me as capturing this problem of what is really a lack of integrity, a lack of integrity. Saying something without kind of taking the care to ensure that it's true. So if you think of all the declarations about net zero in 2015 and in around between 2015 and 2018, there were a lot of corporations, governments, everybody suddenly declared a goal for net zero. And most of them clearly had no idea what a net zero goal would entail, but they were saying, well, by 2050 we'll be carbon neutral or net zero. And it was so clear that there was this trend of repeating it. So it wasn't that necessarily they were lying, but they were repeating this idea without taking the time to understand the assumptions that underlie the idea of carbon neutrality or net zero. They were making this pledge without thinking about really what it entailed. So it wasn't that there was this deliberate attempt to deceive. It was more just like this indifference to whether it's true or not. There was no attempt really to verify the veracity of what they were saying. So it took a few years. I'm sure most of us in the room can relate to the experience of starting to write a paper, planning it, and then it sits in the drawer because you have other things, other commitments and priorities. And so I started writing this paper, and eventually I published it in 2020, which I was using these ideas of Harry Frankfurt to outline what I saw as the pervasiveness of this problem in the context of climate change. I kind of mapped out the extent and the incidences of indifference to truth in global climate governance. But of course, some of the reactions to it were, well, what do we do about this? Why? It's not enough to know that it's happening, but why does it happen? And what can we do about it? And I didn't have any real answers to that question at that time, but I did begin to think more seriously and carefully about, well, why does this occur? What allows it to occur? And what might we do to resolve the problem? So I began to read more literature in sociology and organizational studies to better understand how a collective actor like a state or an organization can create this kind of decoupling between what they say and what they do. And what I found was this concept of organized hypocrisy. This is how organizational sociologists were understanding kind of this decoupling or the inconsistencies between rhetoric, decisions, and actions. So organized hypocrisy refers to the intended or the unintended consequences, the intended or unintended inconsistencies between talk, decisions, and actions that arise as a result of competing external demands. So organizations, whether it be a local government, a university, a state, a UN agency, organizations face different and often competing demands. They might have demands from lobbyists, from voters, from trade unions, from shareholders, from stakeholders, and they're listening to these competing demands, and often it will be simply impossible to satisfy all of the demands. As the saying goes, you can't please everyone. But usually an organization won't want to admit that they can't please everyone. Usually they'll want to avoid kind of disappointing or alienating any one of those different audiences who are making demands. Perhaps it depends on certain audiences for money, for material resources, or it depends on them for legitimacy. And so the organization has an incentive to at least give the impression that they're responding to demands from different audiences, even if it's actually impossible to please everyone. They have to at least give the impression that that's what they're doing. And hypocrisy gives them a way of doing this, of giving the impression of pleasing everyone. So what does this look like? What does organized hypocrisy look like? It looks like this decoupling of talk, decisions, and actions. So the actor, whether it be the university, the local government, the UN agency, the organization talks in a way that aims to satisfy the demands of one audience. They make a decision that responds to another audience, and it acts in a way that satisfies yet another audience. Sometimes this will be very deliberate, will be strategic and deliberate. Other times it may be less intentional. So if we think about how organizations are often structured in silos. So if we think of government ministries, government departments, they're often organized in these silos. And as we can see, like in this photo of silos, those of you who have been had some experience with agriculture at this scale may recognize this kind of the way that the grains are contained in different containers, and there is no link between them. Many organizations are structured in this way. So the state might have, for example, let's take the example of the agricultural ministry. The Department of Agriculture is separate to the Department of Environment, and there usually aren't mechanisms. Traditionally, there are very few mechanisms that connect those departments in a real way to ensure that they act in consistent ways. So each of those departments might have their own strategy. The Agricultural Ministry might have a strategy for expanding livestock production, expanding trade exports, while the Environment Ministry has a strategy for reducing deforestation or for expanding protected areas. Now, it will usually be easier for the government to allow this decoupling to occur. So it's easier for the government to allow strategies with different, with inconsistent objectives to exist in parallel, rather than really take the time to analyze the strategies in relation to one another, to identify the inconsistencies and to resolve them. Usually that is not politically desirable. It will be difficult, but it's also politically, it's not usually a very attractive option. So the government might send a delegation to a UN biodiversity conference with their delegates talking about how they're committed to reducing deforestation, expanding protected areas. The same government sends a trade delegation to China, for example, to try to secure a larger share, market share of exports for beef, for livestock. Now, if an analyst takes the time to scrutinize those different strategies, they might find huge inconsistencies. But most governments don't have these kind of interministerial mechanisms in place to carry out that kind of scrutiny. So this is where these inconsistencies can occur, perhaps kind of unintentionally, but unintentionally in the sense that it could be avoided, but it's best to let it occur. So let me share with you a couple of examples that Niels Brunson was the sociologist, the Swedish sociologist who first conceptualized this phenomenon of organized hypocrisy. So he saw this as a functional practice, as this decoupling, or saying one thing and doing another, this decoupling of words and actions. He saw this as a way that simply allows organizations to function in complex environments. So he says that in this quote, hypocrisy is a way of handling situations when what is said cannot be done, and what is done cannot be talked about. Hypocrisy means that we can continue to talk about the things that can be talked about and do the things that can be done. So he gave lots of interesting examples in this book, The Organization of Hypocrisy, and I'll share a couple of examples with you just to illustrate what this looks like. A couple of examples from Sweden. So the first example is relates to this. So the Swedish government was facing competing demands about hens, about caged hens. So hens being kept in these small cages to produce eggs. So animal rights activists were demanding that the government abolish the use of these small cages because they were seen to impose suffering on the animals. The egg producers were demanding that the government take no action because they were worried about the costs of having to change their production systems. And so in 1987, the Swedish government decided to ban housing hens in small cages, but they decided to do so over a 10-year period. So they said that, okay, we recognize this problem, we're going to phase out these cages, but we're going to do it over 10 years. So that decision, that announcement, satisfied the demands of the animal rights activists. But to avoid upsetting the egg producers, who were concerned about those higher costs, the government, a government agency, continued to issue these exemptions on a continual basis, and widespread exemptions, which meant that not only 10 years later, the vast majority of hens were still in cages. So they'd made this decision, announced a decision to buy time, but they bought time which allowed them to say one thing and do another. So 15 years later, most hens were still living in cages, and the activists kind of renewed their pressure to force the government to keep their promise. But it ended up taking 30 years instead of the promised 10 years. So this strategy of buying time, I think, is a really crucial part of this organized hypocrisy, and it's certainly one we see in climate change. Another example that he gave from Sweden shows how setting a long-term goal can help to satisfy incompatible demands in the present. So this second example from Sweden refers to the use of nuclear energy. There was, back in 1980, there was a referendum, a public referendum, about whether Sweden should phase out nuclear power. The majority of citizens who voted in the referendum said, yes, we want to phase out nuclear power. And the government decided to honor the vote, the public vote. And they said that we'll phase out nuclear power over 25 years. Now, 25 years passed, and the promise hadn't been met. There was still, widespread and a continued commitment to the use of nuclear power in Sweden. So some groups were renewing their pressure, saying, look, the government made this promise in 1980, the public voted to phase out nuclear energy, you need to honor this promise. Other groups, other social groups were saying that no, the government should abandon that promise because the referendum was in 1980, that was a long time ago. Many of the people who participated in that referendum are, no longer alive. Many of the young voters today weren't able to participate in the referendum because perhaps they hadn't even been born. So the government bought time back in 1980, but eventually they were confronted with the failure to deliver on that promise. And so what did they do? Well, the government responded by saying that, yes, nuclear power plants need to be shut down in the future when alternative sources have become available. And they didn't establish a time frame. So again, they bought time again, but without a definite timeline to kind of give them a bit more flexibility. So each of these two examples with the chickens and nuclear power show how a government makes decisions that buys time, and if there's a way of saying one thing and doing another, while hoping that the problem will go away. Now, this kind of practice is really common in international politics. Scholars of international relations, a number of scholars of international relations have used these ideas of Niels Brunson to explain the dynamics within states, within international organizations like the European Union, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, various UN agencies have been analyzed from this perspective. Now, of course, recently we've seen a renewed attention to hypocrisy in world politics in the context of the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. States have long taken for granted that hypocrisy has no consequences, that saying one thing and doing another allows you to function in a complex environment, and it doesn't have any kind of consequences. But it's no longer clear to states that this is the case. Countries such as India, and indeed many countries in the global south, have refused to support sanctions against Russia, in part because of what they perceive as hypocrisy on the part of the West. So there is this sense now that, you know, maybe actions and words cannot be decoupled indefinitely. At some point, people will be held to account for this inconsistency. So let me just give a couple of examples of international relations scholars who have analyzed this organized hypocrisy in the international space, and then I'll relate this directly to climate change. So on the left, we see this book by Stephen Krasner. Stephen Krasner is an important scholar of international relations, and he published this book 25 years ago on sovereignty, organized hypocrisy. And he argued that sometimes states are explicit about their intentions. Sometimes states are explicit that they are acting in their own self-interest. But other times, states dress up their actions with moral rhetoric or appeals to normative principles, the principles of justice and non-intervention. And he explained that organized hypocrisy occurs when states say one thing but do another. So they rhetorically endorse the normative rules or principles associated with sovereignty, but their policies and actions violate these rules. So in the international system, there are clear rules about how sovereignty works, that you can't intervene. You can't intervene in the affairs of another country. You can't intervene militarily to cross their borders. These rules exist. Everybody knows that the rules exist, but everybody knows that sometimes the rules are violated. Everybody knows the rules are violated, but they don't try to change the rules because they know that sometimes everybody needs to break the rules. So they generally accept hypocrisy. There has been this idea that most countries tolerate hypocrisy because everybody recognizes that in general the rules are good, but sometimes we'll need to violate those rules. that idea now that hypocrisy has no consequences or is tolerable is now being questioned, as you know, as countries in the global south are saying, you know, yeah, no, we're not going to sanction Russia because no, this hypocrisy is not acceptable. Now, Stephen Krasner said that it's not just that states don't take certain issues, certain problems seriously. He says that they can't be consistent all the time because the problems that they are dealing with are so complex and so unpredictable that in some instances, being inconsistent is the only way to protect one's interests, the state's interests. I was at another conference recently under Chatham House rules, and there was an Indian scholar there who said, well, hypocrisy is just how adults deal with the real world. This pragmatic approach. Well, you know, the world is a complex, difficult place. Adults deal with it by being hypocritical. On the right here, we see this book by Catherine Weaver, who she analysed organised hypocrisy in the World Bank in the context of their commitment to sustainable development. Now, back in the 1980s, the World Bank was facing a lot of pressure to reform their environmental policies. The World Bank made rhetorical commitments to sustainable development. The World Bank established a new environmental unit, but the bank didn't commit sufficient resources, financial resources, to ensure that that environmental unit was really effective or that could actually achieve its stated objectives. Neither did the bank take sufficient effort, or didn't make sufficient effort to modify other departments within the World Bank to ensure that they were consistent with the environmental concerns or the objectives of this new environmental unit. So the bank responded to these external demands by establishing an environmental unit, but at the same time, they decoupled that action from their other actions, where other units within the World Bank were pursuing actions and strategies that were completely inconsistent with the environmental unit. And Catherine Weaver explained that this was simply how the bank responded to this complex environment. There were lots of interests, against mainstreaming environmentalism into the World Bank, and so that it wasn't to be able to function in that complex environment with competing demands. The World Bank employed this strategy of hypocrisy. Now, it's certainly true that international organizations and states are operating in very complex environments. So perhaps it's unsurprising that hypocrisy is so prevalent. Many of the problems that states and international organizations are addressing are very complex and multidimensional, and they are characterized by different demands, inconsistent demands from different groups. So it's difficult for them to ensure consistency. And this brings me back to the issue of climate change, which is perhaps the most complex global problem of all. So perhaps it's unsurprising that there is so much organized hypocrisy within climate policy, within the organizations that are responsible for developing policies, implementing actions to address climate change. Now, I argue that the UN system, with the UNFCCC at its center, has enabled organized hypocrisy for 30 years. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was established over 30 years ago. And I think over that 30-year period, the system has been designed in such a way that enables rather than avoids or prevents organized hypocrisy. And this, although I wasn't using this concept at the time, this was reflected in my first book. So I published my first book in 2013, and I wrote about the paradox of global climate governance. And I argued in that book that although successful global action to avoid climate change depends on states complying with international agreements, the present system, the UNFCCC, induces states to comply with global norms in ways that actually exacerbate unsustainable development. International rules were designed that allowed states to buy time. Buying time has been a strategy, a really common strategy in the UNFCCC. Now, in the late 1990s, we saw that the focus of negotiations shifted towards these future emissions. Like, what could we do to avoid future emissions? Attention turned towards practices of offsetting. You know, remember the clean development mechanism, purchasing credits to offset future emissions in developing countries, and developed countries could use those credits to avoid reducing emissions at home. So climate change became understood as this technical problem that could be resolved by mitigating emissions at the cheapest possible source, rather than transforming the drivers of excessive emissions in developed countries or at the present time. The focus was on, you know, what can we do to avoid emissions in the future? Now, this enabled enormous delays in restructuring unsustainable practices in wealthy countries where, you know, political will was really lacking. So just like the Swedish government with their caged hens, governments were buying time to avoid upsetting powerful interests. Over the past decade, pressure has grown on all countries to take ambitious domestic action, but the rules of the UNFCCC continue to allow inconsistencies between rhetoric and action. So let me just give a few examples of the kind of decoupling that we see in the context of climate change. So what does organized hypocrisy look like in the UN climate system? Firstly, the rules allow states to pledge targets that are based on unproven technologies or disproven methods. Many of these long-term targets around net zero, for example, are based on the idea that technology will be able to capture and store safely and permanently emissions, and there is no real objective reason to have confidence have confidence in those technologies. On the contrary, countries are not obliged to include all of their emissions in their emissions inventories. So countries are required to submit an inventory that lists all of their emissions, but they're not required to include, for example, military emissions. The Kyoto Protocol excluded military emissions from reporting, and the Paris Agreement made them optional. So it made it optional for states to include military emissions in their inventories or not. There's been absolutely no effort within the UNFCCC to ensure that emissions from the production of arms from military equipment are reported. There's been no effort to ensure that the impact of military operations, the greenhouse gas emissions of military operations are evaluated, calculated, and reported. So this allows governments to say one thing about the the ambition of their pledges, while doing another thing, or protecting certain sensitive sectors. Similarly, with fossil fuel subsidies, the rules of the UNFCCC do not oblige countries to fully disclose their fossil fuel subsidies. Countries will often talk about their carbon price. They'll say, well, we've put a price on carbon. We have a carbon tax, or we have an emissions trading scheme, and this reflects our ambition. But those mechanisms, the carbon price or an emissions trading scheme, they're undermined if a country continues to use public money to support the fossil fuel industry, to sustain fossil fuel infrastructure. So in many countries, the state is taking with one hand, so they're imposing a tax or emissions trading scheme, but then they're giving back with the other hand, using public money to subsidize the fossil fuel industries. It's astonishing that in the year 2025, billions of public dollars are still being used to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. Countries have long been allowed to set long-term goals. Indeed, they're encouraged to set long-term goals without the need to demonstrate clear pathways to achieving them. So this is this idea of buying time. And the accountability mechanisms of the UNFCCC are designed in a way that undermines external scrutiny and judgment of countries' domestic mitigation plans. Now, I'd just like to ask the organisers how much time I have available, just so I can decide how to proceed. 5 minutes, or I can continue it on for another 5 minutes. Is that okay?
I think that's fine.
Okay.
Another 5 minutes is all right.
Okay, perfect.
You can take your time, ma'am.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so in short, there's this long history of organised hypocrisy in the UNFCCC. The system is being designed to enable talking in one way and acting in another. So as a result, what we often see is states declaring their ambition, despite the fact that their policies and their actions reflect inadequate commitment to averting climate catastrophe. Now, one of the reasons that this occurs is that scrutiny is very hard. It's for the average concerned citizen, or even for the committed activist, it's really hard to detect these inconsistencies. Cynically, we might assume that hypocrisy is everywhere, but effectively holding an actor to account for their inconsistencies, it requires more than just having this kind of cynical hunch. We really need to be able to pinpoint to precisely, with the precision of a prosecutor, to be able to say, well, this is where the inconsistencies lie. Because unless we can be really precise in identifying where the inconsistencies are, it's too easy for actors just to give misleading rhetoric to dismiss the charge of hypocrisy. So many countries in the global north, they say, well, we don't have fossil fuel subsidies. We phase them out. But it's because that they adopt these very narrow definitions of what a subsidy is. Consumer subsidy, which is only one form of fossil fuel subsidy, they say that, well, we don't have fossil fuel subsidies. Now, for most concerned citizens, or even many activists, it requires a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of expertise, a lot of resources to be able to really detect where these inconsistencies are. And usually that doesn't happen. We see organised hypocrisy sustain or be stable over time because usually there isn't much scrutiny. but what would happen if there was? What would happen if behavior did come under closer scrutiny and if consistency was demanded? At the moment, that's more of a hypothetical question because we don't know. The Paris Agreement has these mechanisms for scrutinizing performance, but I say scrutinizing very generously because really they're designed to avoid much scrutiny of the actual content of these of countries' NDCs, their national determined contributions, and certainly they avoid making any kind of normative judgment about whether these nationally determined contributions are sufficient or not. So we have these two mechanisms in the Paris Agreement, the transparency framework, the enhanced transparency framework, and the global stocktake. Perhaps if during questions, I can say a little bit more about that if people are interested. But I think the point that I would like to make is that these two mechanisms have been designed in such a way as to really avoid scrutinizing individual states' policies and practices to ensure that they are consistent with what they are pledging to do. I think ultimately it's not going to come from the UNFCCC. I think the pressure to ensure greater scrutiny will need to come from the public. I think it will need to come down to us as scholars, as the academic community, to find more effective ways of working with civil society to scrutinize and to publicize inconsistencies in climate promises and actions. And I think that this is really important beyond the issue of climate change. We're living in a time now where the lack of trust in public institutions at the national level and at the international level, has never been greater. There is an American writer, Alana Newhouse, who recently talked about, in the context of American politics, that the divide and the debate is no longer between the left and the right, but it's between the brokenness, those who see political institutions as broken and that they need to be replaced, and on the other hand, the status quo people, the people who think that, yeah, there might be problems with these institutions, but we need to reform them. Now, I think at the international level, there are many people who think that international institutions are broken and that they need to be replaced. Where I live in Argentina, we have our president who is saying that international institutions are broken. We're withdrawing from the World Health Organization. I don't think that that's the right way forward. I think these institutions need to be reformed, and I think to rebuild trust in political institutions, we need to show that these institutions can be reformed. So I think we need to think more about how scholars, experts, and civil society can try to work within the UNFCCC with the UNFCCC to introduce more kind of critical scrutiny to show that these institutions can work. So despite my observation that over 30 years that organized hypocrisy has been a massive problem in the UNFCCC, in the UNF system, I certainly don't support dismantling that system. I think we do need to reform them, and that's a big question about how we can do that. So that's the massive challenge that we face now, especially in a time when there are so many other issues that are demanding attention. The issue of trade wars and tariffs and wars, conflict, ethnic cleansing, all of these issues are competing for our attention and deserve attention. But how we can keep climate change on the agenda and demand consistent, coherent action is important, but it's going to be really hard. So I'll end there.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Haley, for your talk. If there are any questions that we can put forward to Haley, we can type them in the chat box, or you can directly, the participants can directly ask Haley. Any questions? From the participants, do you have any questions? Okay, Dr. Haley, there are two things. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. There are just two things I would like you to discuss on. Right, there's one question. You can tackle that one first. It's from, 1 second. Right, there's a question that says, how can developing countries balance economic growth with aggressive climate policies without compromising its development goals?
Well, that's that's a massive question, and I'm sure there are many people in the room who are better qualified to answer that. I think it's hard to it's hard to generalize across developing countries, because many developing countries are very vulnerable to climate change, and their development goals will be completely undermined if they cannot adapt to climate change. So there is a question of, how vulnerable is the country, whether their development goals are compatible with that vulnerability, whether those development goals have been designed to account for that vulnerability, whether economic growth is the best way of ensuring well-being in the long term. In the case of vulnerable countries, maybe economic growth shouldn't be the priority. The priority, framing the goal as economic growth doesn't really place people at the center of policy. The economy can grow in really bad ways. So when there is a natural disaster and infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, that can actually contribute to economic growth, because we've suffered so badly and we need to rebuild. Rebuilding, to give an extreme example, rebuilding in Gaza is going to be economically beneficial for many actors. Does that mean that it's a good thing? I don't think that we should talk about kind of economic growth as the objective of improving people's lives. There are certainly alternative energy sources that place people's well-being at the center, rather than fossil fuel sources that are that are inconsistent in the long term with people's well-being, irrespective of whether it's good for economic growth or not. So I would kind of shift the framing to focus more on people's well-being, rather than balancing economic growth with aggressive climate policies. So I think it's possible to balance people's well-being with aggressive climate policies. And I think that should be the focus, rather than trying to balance economic growth with aggressive climate policies.
I think those are very good points that you've stressed over there. Is there any other question that you'd like to put forward? Yes, I have two things that if you could shed light on. The first, you said that when you were talking about organized hypocrisy, you have a different talk, a different decision, and a different act or action for different audiences. Now, in such narratives, often what we see is that the voice of the minority is often never heard in such talks, in such decision-making processes. I would like your thoughts on that. That's the first point. The second is, when it comes to any policy, including climate change, policies tend to change with governments. I would like your thoughts on how can governments with opposing views or even agendas come to an agreement on issues of tackling climate change, and more importantly, agree on the continuity of the decisions agreed upon, if any are agreed at all. So just your thoughts on this, please.
Yes, they're two really, really interesting and important points and questions. The first on that often the voice of the minority is not heard. I think sometimes that is a problem, that the minorities are not heard. But I think often the problem is that minorities are heard, and that it's minorities that determine the decisions that are taken. So if we think of very strong, powerful lobby groups, oil executives, they are a minority. Their interests are a minority, but they manage to convince governments that their minority interests are actually the national interest. So I think we face these two challenges. On the one hand, there are marginalized minorities that should be heard, and we need to think about how to increase the volume of their voice. But at the same time, there are these non-marginal minorities, very, very powerful minorities, that somehow we need to reduce the volume of their voices. Now, the question of policies changing when governments change. There has often been this assumption that, at least in foreign policy, that there is a state policy, so that countries can negotiate because there aren't massive changes when the governments change. So if we think about the World Trade Organization over several decades, many of these, much of the existing liberal international order has been based on the fact that government policies don't change dramatically when either the left comes to power or the right comes to power. Now that is no longer that is certainly no longer the case. I think with climate change we have seen countries' priorities or policies change, at least somewhat, when there is a change of government. But that is becoming much more dramatic now, because we're seeing this return to denialist climate change positions. We're seeing the return of countries withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, and I don't know how we can, force them to come to an agreement. I don't think that's realistic. These are political questions, but it does certainly make it much harder to negotiate at the international level, because when countries see that other countries are not reliable, then they're much more hesitant to negotiate with them. So even if the United States returns to the negotiating table, if there's a change in government in 4 years' time, and the United States returns to the negotiating table, it's really hard to trust them. It's hard to trust them as a reliable negotiating partner. So I think that this has really negative international impacts when there is such a strong shift at the domestic level, and that's going to make it really hard to make the UN system, the UN climate system, really functional, because it's going to be increasingly hard to trust countries to participate and to do what they say they will that they will do. So I don't know. I don't have any easy answers, because these are questions that don't have easy answers, but they're massive challenges that we'll be grappling with for many years to come.
Right, I think that's true. I mean, it's difficult to come to consensus, considering where the world is in at the moment. We have I think 2 more questions. The first is, can you shed light on the influence and impact of modernity on the indigenous environmental conservation practices in Argentina? And there's another one I think you can see in your chat, which is what is your take on symbolic commitments without meaningful implementation? I think you can shed light on these two questions.
Yes, fantastic question. Thank you so much. I'll take the second one first. What is my take on symbolic commitments without meaningful implementation? I think they're potentially dangerous because people become cynical, and rightfully so. I think it's understandable that people start to lose trust. People lose trust in institutions when they hear these symbolic commitments and then they don't see any action to really to implement those commitments. And I think cynicism is really dangerous in this, not just in the climate change space, but more generally for our political institutions. So what I've been talking about today, this hypocrisy, is functional in the short term. It allows governments to function in complex environments where there are competing demands, but I think it's dangerous in the long term because it breaks down people's trust. People feel cynical about political institutions. They begin to think that lies. Everybody lie. Like all the politicians are the same. They all lie. I think that's really dangerous for democracy. So I think symbolic commitments without meaningful implementation should be avoided. I think they're dangerous. They're wrong. The question about the influence and impact of indigenous environmental conservation practices in Argentina. Look, in Argentina, there are people who identify as indigenous, and they face a really strong challenge being recognized as indigenous. The mainstream politicians across the political spectrum and deny that there are really many indigenous people in Argentina. So when people make claims based on their indigenous status, they're usually dismissed. So there is very little respect for indigeneity within Argentina. Usually people are seen as having ulterior motives, that they want to steal people's land. There is a lot of attention to so-called indigenous people stealing public land or stealing other people's land, and that's what gets the attention. So unfortunately, it's not a very positive picture in Argentina on that front. There is not a lot of respect or recognition of indigenous people or indigenous conservation practices. Now, this final question that's coming, I'm seeing, how does the prevalence of organized democracy in global climate governance affect public trust and the willingness of citizens to adopt sustainable practices? Yeah, I mean, I've responded to that a little bit, but the impact on people, whether people are willing to take action in their own lives when they see that there is this insincerity at the political level. It's hard to sustain. There will always be some people who are willing to make sacrifices in their own lives to stop driving a car, to install solar panels on their roofs, or in some cases to stop taking flights. We've seen that in Europe, where there's been this movement of people saying we're not going to fly anymore, we're going to return to using the trains. But it's very marginal, and I think it's great if people feel that they want to take those individual actions in their own personal lives. But I don't think that's going to be enough to respond to these challenges. We need collective action. We need political institutions to design collective responses. And I think even though there will be some people who will take individual action to adopt sustainable lifestyles. Many others will not, because they have become cynical. They've become kind of pessimistic. They just think that, well, the government's not taking this seriously. Why should I? My take on the recent US elections, the solidification of oligarchy in politics and its implications for our collective futures in terms of policies pertaining to environment and climate change. Yeah, it's really hard to be optimistic at the moment. It's really hard to be optimistic and positive. I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. Now, I think that Trump has this strategy of drill, baby, drill. Now, President Biden before him did not openly say drill, baby, drill, but that was basically his approach. So I think sometimes there is it's tempting to think, well, everything is now a disaster because Donald Trump is in power. But really, the position of the previous US government, even the Democrats who say that they're committed to climate change, were still using public money to support the fossil fuel industry. They were still issuing exploration for petroleum. They were still doing many of the things that Donald Trump is doing. They were just, a bit more hypocritical about it. They didn't say drill, baby, drill. So I think that things were already bad. It was already a disaster in terms of climate policy under the previous administration in the US. And things are much worse now, especially because we have this US administration that just wants to tear everything down. They want to dismantle the state. They want to dismantle state capacity to regulate. They want to withdraw from international institutions or dismantle those international institutions. And things were already bad before Trump, but it's going to be much harder to cooperate and design kind of effective policy, not only during this 4-year period, but potentially after. In 4 years' time, if the US electorate votes for a democratic government or a government that is, shows a real commitment to climate change, it's going to be much harder to take action because much of the state capacity is going to have been obliterated. And unfortunately, we're seeing that, it's happening really quickly, that it's going to be really hard to rebuild these departments and regulations once they've been dismantled. So it's we're in for a very tough few years because all of us are affected by what happens in the United States.
Right. I think, Haley, we have just one last question.
Yeah.
And then we can end the session. This question I would like you to have your thoughts on is how can scholars or the academic community contribute to making our political institutions more accountable for their words or actions, especially on the issues of tackling climate change?
Yeah. I think we need to, it depends, because in different countries, the situation is different. Where I am in Argentina, and in many countries, in fact, there is this distrust in experts. So in Argentina, the experts or the research community are increasingly seen as, part of the political caste. They're not seen as being in the public interest or working in ways that support the public interest. So I think part of the challenge is working on demonstrating the public benefit of what we do. That even if we work in private universities, I also work in a private university, but everything that I do is done with the public benefit in mind. And somehow we need to work to rebuild trust in our work, in our intentions, in our research, and the intentions we have with our research, that what we're trying to do. That's a big challenge. That's a big challenge, and gosh, I love that question, because it forces me to think more carefully about what it is that we can do individually and collectively as an academic community to rebuild faith in what we do, and to rebuild trust that we are actually working for the public interest.
Right. I think, are there any more questions? Right. So I think we do not have any more questions from the participants. Haley, one last thing is, thank you very much for your insights on such an important topic, and it was lovely to hear your talk, and lovely to hear your insights and sharing your thoughts on the different questions that the participants have put up to you. Thank you so very much.
No, thank you very much. Hopefully I'll see you again in 10 years' time. Well, I'll come back. We'll talk again.
Brilliant. Thank you. Brilliant. We'd love to have you in person.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Jim,
enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank from the organizing committee from UCC, Professor Haley first, for very insightful, talk that we had here. We did really enjoy, and then we learned a lot of, new insights from this as well. And we do understand, sort of a symbolic, promises that we do make, and then not very serious about implementing it. We have been seeing it. And I think it takes a lot of courage and convictions to really come hard on them, and then to really protest this. This is where I really appreciate, Professor Haley, that you have been doing this. And so we look forward to be working together, Professor Haley, in the near future as well. Thank you very much for accepting invitations. And lastly, I would like to also thank, Dr. Eros for graciously accepting the invitation, and this, despite having this busy schedule, graciously had accepted the invitation to host this and chair this session here today. Thank you, Dr. Eros, for chairing the session. And I also like to thank the participants and others who have made these things possible. Thank you all very much.
I think we have come to the end of this seminar, so we can leave the Zoom link. Thank you, and good night. She's not there anymore. She left.
Thank you, Dr. Eros.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you from UCC.
Thank you so much.
Bati, are you still there?
Nothing else left. Pause the recording.
Yes.